missverstanden haben, die ja durch Nietzsches Schwester Nietzsche als ihren Ideologen eigentlich, geistigen Vater für ihre Rassentheorie als Grundlage angenommen haben. So ist Übermensch nicht zu verstehen. Übermensch heißt überwinden, einen neuen Weg suchen, nämlich auf den Weg ohne diese göttliche Figur, die mich hindert am Leben, sondern der Mensch, der in völliger Freiheit neue Wege sucht und in diesem Sinn gottlos ist.
If you translate Superman as the overman, which some people do, the Übermensch, the mountains were in a sense the overworld. They represented for Nietzsche a place of self-transcendence. And their opposite was the land down below, ordinary life, common life, that which had to be transcended.
I am a wanderer and a mountain climber, Zarathustra said to his heart. What returns, what finally comes home to me is my own self. Alas, I have begun my loneliest walk. But whoever is of my kind cannot escape such an hour. The hour which says to him, only now are you going your way to greatness. Peak and abyss, they are now joined together. For all things are baptized in a well of eternity and lie beyond good and evil.
In conceiving of a world beyond good and evil, beyond the fleeting preoccupations of the human condition, Nietzsche had transcended the muck, as he called it, of his own life experience and turned it into philosophical gold. But now, living virtually in total isolation in Sils Maria, he had all but sacrificed human contact for the world of his own imagination. Philosophy had become his consolation for a life of disappointment and deep-rooted loneliness.
My principal article of faith is that one can only flourish among people who share the identical ideas and the identical will. I have no one. That is my sickness. If, adopting a popular manner, I recommend Schopenhauer or Wagner to the Germans or conjure up Zarathustras, these are my remedies. Above all else, they are hiding places where I can lose myself for a time.
But even for Nietzsche, such extremes of isolation eventually took their toll. In 1888, he moved down from the Alps to the Italian city of Turin, echoing Zarathustra's descent from his solitary mountain. Having, as he saw it, liberated humanity from its past, Nietzsche now set about redefining its future. He began formulating a new system of values for a society in which God was no more, a new morality beyond Christian virtues such as self-denial and pity. He called this project, which he hoped would be his crowning achievement, the transvaluation of all values.
What is good? Everything that heightens the feeling of power in man, the will to power, power itself. What is bad? Everything that is born of weakness. What is more harmful than any vice? Active pity for all the failures and all the weak. That is Christianity. Christianity is the religion of pity. We are deprived of strength when we feel pity.
He had these great plans to transvalue all values. That was his That was his project, and the books he wrote, The Antichrist and the Twilight of the Idols, were part of that project. But I do think he had a sense of time running out. I've found certain evidence that suggests to me he was aware of his growing incapacity, of the nature of his illness, and he had some thoughts about his own mortality.
This was a man who died young and spent most of his life dying. So it's entirely understandable that he would have been infused by pessimism, and that he would have a tendency to weirdly align himself with the death of the culture that he was describing. The two became one for him in a bizarre way, and this is why you find him nodding out over the re-evaluation of all values, claiming to have written it in his last book, Ecce Homo, this projected title plan for a 5-volume work, and of course that was never achieved. There you have the pessimism of him never being able to come close to enacting what, after all, was a systematized destruction of systems. That's what he was aiming to do.
The transvaluation of all values. That is my formula for an act of supreme re-examination on the part of humanity. It is my fate that I have to be the first decent human being.
He saw it as his task to prescribe a morality for a civilization that had to live on without any divine sanctions. He was right, so far as he went, to question history, question logic, question all those assumptions that had been made. But when the point came to reconstitute something, the task turned out to be impossible for him. He had an absolutely marvelous mind, but that marvelous mind led him into a cul-de-sac, and if there is no way out, what do you do?
If you look at the letters he wrote in the beginning of January 89, I think it's quite obvious that he's mad. I mean, he signs these letters Dionysus, or the crucified one. He really thought of himself as a god taking upon him the suffering of all mankind, a sort of Christ figure. But I do think that's also, that reflects his theory that every man should be a god unto himself.
I think Nietzsche saw the challenge of being human in a very simple phrase. He spoke of the human condition as being zwischen Tier und Übermensch, that is, between the animal and the Superman. That is the challenge of the human condition. What you make out of your, as it were, endowment as an animal, how far you can go along the journey towards becoming a god. In January 1889, Nietzsche collapsed in the street in Turin, somehow overcome with sympathy at the sight of a horse that fell, overburdened or slipped on ice. The horse fell, and Nietzsche went over and put his arms around the horse. And of course Nietzsche has always been known as the philosopher against pity. But he was able to express in one of his last gestures to the world profound sympathy for the living condition that animals and human beings share.
Nietzsche's last sane action had been to affirm his identity not as a god, but as a man full of human weaknesses. Soon after his collapse in Turin, he was moved to an asylum and then back to his mother's house in Germany. Declared clinically insane, he passed his last years under his sister Elizabeth's care in this house in Weimar.
Elizabeth would let people come and have a look at her brother as the philosopher, like an animal in a zoo, and who knows, being mentally in another world already. There has been intense speculation about the nature of his illness, that progressive paralysis could result from this syphilitic infection. But there are certain things about that diagnosis which don't fit in. For example, his living as more or less a vegetable for 11 years. That's an enormously long time for a person with that paralysis to go on living.
In 1900, Nietzsche died from a stroke. Over the next 30 years, Elizabeth took control of her brother's literary estate, including the unfinished transvaluation of all values.